And the Oscar goes to...
And the Oscar goes to...
And the Oscar goes to...
I don't care!
What's next?
What's next?
What's next?
Don't you want to hear what's next?
What are you going to do next?
What's next for you?
What's next?
What's next?
Okay, so what's next?
I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of After the Gold. And this week we're going to be looking at the 1979 adaptation of the hit Broadway musical Hair, directed by Milos Forman, after his huge success of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. But if you're new to the series, that's what we do every single week. We talk about Best Picture follow-up movies. What is the movie a director makes right after winning Best Picture? And what does that tell us about them as a filmmaker? What did they decide to put their kind of creative capital and blank check status into? And does that give us an indication as what they are as a filmmaker, what makes them tick? Did we see increases in budgets, things like that? So that's kind of the first part of the video, the production history. How did this movie get made? Its modern day cultural reputation and how it did ultimately at the Oscars. Sometimes a director will win Best Picture and then their next movie will also win Best Picture. Sometimes it's a bit of a disappointment. And sometimes the movie's actually even better though than the movie that won Best Picture. And that's what we kind of look at more so in the second half of the video, giving my thoughts on the film and why I think it's interesting. We don't really have a kind of philosophy in terms of what movie gets covered what week. We kind of jump all over the place in terms of 90s and 40s and 2000s and 2020s. But ultimately the one through line is that I think either the production history is interesting or the movie itself is interesting. I probably pretty much recommend all of the movies that we've covered on this channel as at the very least interesting movies, and in some instances some of the best movies of all time. So happy to talk about Hair today and my relationship with Milos Forman. But if you have any thoughts about the movie Hair or Milos Forman or One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest or anything like that, feel free to comment down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts as always. But without further ado, let's jump into things, starting off with that production history. And 1979, the Hair comes out. Bit of an odd release at the time just because it'd been about 10 years since the Broadway musical was a huge success. And an odd kind of selection for Milos Forman post One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. But before we go forwards, we've got to go backwards. Let's talk about One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. 1975 was a huge hit at the Oscars and the box office. The second highest grossing movie of the year off of a small budget. It was a massive kind of breakthrough success. The movie is also widely celebrated at the Oscars. One of only 3 movies to get what's considered the Big Five, which is Best Picture, Best Director, Best Screenplay, and then Best Lead Actor, Best Lead Actress. That alongside Silence of the Lambs and It Happened One Night. It was a unique period of time in Hollywood too, where the 70s were kind of in the middle of the new Hollywood, American cinema being interesting and having big budgets to tell kind of these adult dramas and stories. And they kept on doing it ultimately though because they were making money and having success. And notably, this is also the first year, I think, of Jaws, so a bit of a inflection point in the history of Hollywood towards more of those blockbusters that we still see today. But One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was a blockbuster in and of itself and widely celebrated. But what's interesting is that it was still kind of a large cast of somewhat unknowns or people who weren't major A-list stars. Jack Nicholson had been nominated multiple times, but it hadn't had a huge hit like this before and had been nominated a few times before. And this has got finally his first Oscar, his first win. And then Milos Forman himself was a Czech filmmaker who had only made one other movie in English, so he wasn't super well known to the Academy as well. And after this movie, kind of, I think, helped define them as maybe new leading voices in the history of cinema. I mean, you just look at the past winners before and after of, let's say 90 or 77, you have Annie Hall with Woody Allen. He becomes a huge figure. Coppola with 72 and 74 with the Godfather movies. He becomes huge figures within the history of Hollywood. So Milos Forman was kind of set up to be the next one. Takes 4 years in 1979, does make Hair. And what's interesting about the movie is that even at the time, people thought that it was kind of an odd choice. I think Forman likely probably just wanted to make something that was different, a musical, totally unlike kind of his more low-key dramas of even some of his Czech films or the satires that he did earlier on. But But it's also interesting because the hippie movement had sort of died at that point. It was fun reading old reviews that were released at the time for Hair, and they all kind of mentioned that it felt like it was a little bit too late for this movie, that Hair was such an important musical because it was released in 68, and you would really say kind of 67 to 69, 70, that was kind of the peak era of the hippie and the hippie movement and the Summer of Love and all those things, and Hair was a musical that was being played that kind of described this movement and was representative of it and was kind of culturally important for defining a period of time and was there at the time of the movement. So the question now becomes, well, why make Hair 10 years later? What's there to say? We've kind of maybe passed this moment, and I think a lot of people felt that way. It didn't really appease a lot of the existing fans of the musical because it was actually quite a bit of a different adaptation, so they didn't like it. Fans of Forman's other works were maybe more confused because it's a musical and completely different, and ultimately I think a lot of people thought that this was a little bit too late of a movie to make. And ultimately, we saw those results at the box office. It did okay. It didn't lose money, but it just kind of did okay. The movie itself didn't get any Oscars, so a big disappointment in that regard for Forman, coming off of some huge success here with One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And then even his modern day reputation, I think, is more mixed. The only reason why I had seen this movie before and wanted to again rewatch it and cover it for the show is because I'm a fan of Milos Forman, and I went back and wanted to check out all his movies when I actually did an episode of Masters of Controlled Chaos, an old series where I broke down directors' work, and I discovered the movie through his filmography. But I don't know if a lot of people are necessarily going to do that and discover Forman's filmography. He's not necessarily on the same level as more popular auteurs of a Hitchcock or a Kubrick, so you're more kind of casual film fan, maybe aren't exploring movies like this. And then even the stars within the movie don't give you a reason to necessarily go and check it out. There are sure a lot of people that maybe will check out a Leonardo DiCaprio movie or a Robert De Niro movie that they did that's maybe flew under the radar because they like those actors. You have Treat Williams and Beverly D'Angelo and John Savage, which are all great actors, but they're also actors that haven't really maintained their cultural status into the 2000s and 2010s, and unlike some of these other actors at this time, like I mentioned, Robert De Niro. So it's not like, people are filling in their missing movies from a John Savage career, for example. Even though everyone's very good in this movie, I think the director and kind of the stars were very much of a 70s time period that necessarily were kind of capturing that time period and were lost ultimately in terms of maybe not of the highest status of your kind of big celebrated auteurs or big celebrated actors. They're kind of in a tier below, and because of that I think the movie has been sort of lost to time a bit. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below though about in terms of what you think that modern day reputation is, but it is I think a movie that isn't as maybe celebrated as any of some of other Forman's films, for example. But I think it is still excellent and worthy of discussion, and a movie that I totally enjoy, and I'll make the case for it now. So transitioning more so into my thoughts on the film, I, for the most part, have a pretty simple relationship to the movie, which is that I like it, I have a good time, and I enjoy the songs, and I enjoy the kind of upbeat spirit of it all. And this is, I mentioned before, a true adaptation, and I haven't seen the original musical, but based on kind of what I've read about it, it does seem that element did kind of carry over, kind of capturing the free-spirited, fun aspects of the hippie culture. We do have that in a kind of linear-ish narrative, but we'll go into these kind of oddball sequences and have these big, long musical set pieces in different kind of unique locations within New York. A lot of my enjoyment just comes from I'm having a great time. Everyone's smiling and laughing and dancing, and the songs are great, and I'm just kind of coming along for the ride. But I do think it is a movie that does transcend kind of that just, hey, fun time, good adaptation of a musical that already exists but doesn't add anything to it. I actually think this is a great adaptation because it is an adaptation. So many plays or musicals to movies I actually don't like too often because they feel like they were originated as plays. They oftentimes are, in one room. But of course, on a play, you only have the stage, so it makes sense to only have it be set in one room or two rooms, for example, because there's only so many set changes that you can make But of course, in the movie, you can set that anywhere, and yet so many filmmakers are not as inspired to make those sorts of changes when adapting a play or adapting a musical onto film. But what I think Forman does smartly is adapt this stage musical into a movie, introduce the character of John Savage, this guy from Oklahoma who's about to be drafted, before he kind of stumbles upon these hippies and has this kind of great 24 to 48 hours. And I think it's a very simple plot device, but one that works effective at underlying some of the more serious themes of the movie. And I think that's what Forman is also able to bring too. Where if this was just an adaptation of the musical, it'd be light, it'd be pop, it'd be fun, it'd have great songs, but I don't know if it would necessarily say anything. And in a way, the reason why people didn't like the movie at the time is, I think, the strength of the movie at the end of the day, which is that it's not necessarily an adaptation of the musical as it is a eulogy of the hippie movement. And I think with the introduction of the John Savage kind of audience surrogate character and his eventual, leading point up to being drafted and going to the army, you have this looming sense of dread and reality that starts to creep in. Because in 79, it makes sense to make an adaptation of Hair, not necessarily as you're trying to recapture that magic, but as, an outsider. This is a Czech filmmaker, in the case of Milos Forman, kind of interested in this movement and is able to take an outsider point of view. And I think what it does, interestingly, is add in the element of the Vietnam War and of the army and of war, because the hippie movement wasn't just a kind of a Halloween costume in the way that, I was kind of learned about it or, saw it in movies like Cars and things like that, where you think of the peace sign and the clothing and whatnot. For the large part of the reason was because of the Vietnam War and that idea of peace and trying to change things for a younger generation. So by adding this element in with the John Savage character and that kind of looming dread of linearity to the ultimate story, it gives an indication of a real, I think, reflectiveness of what this movement was and what it was for, because you can't separate kind of the movement, I think, from the kind of political implications of the reason why it maybe even started up. Yes, it was kind of free-spiritedness and LSD and kind of personal spiritual exploration, but it was also in large part due to, a protest movement against society and against kind of the impositions of war and kind of the traditional American way of life. And so to me, I think it's one of the few pieces of media that I've really seen that actually tries to engage with the idea of the hippie movement. Yes, they wear colorful clothing and were singing great songs in this case, but why were they doing that? What was it for? How did those consequences kind of creep up? A story that you could only tell in 1979. So I think in many ways, this isn't a perfect adaptation of Hair, but using Hair, the musical, to kind of interrogate and to understand what the hippie movement was, to understand its place in time, to understand its kind of positives, but also kind of the dread and ultimately kind of the failure of it, because the Vietnam War still went on for many more years, and of course wars never end, and how that kind of died off into the next generation, into the 80s. It wasn't kind of a huge change and a revolution in the same way maybe the people participating wanted it to. I mean, marijuana, for example, hasn't still been legalized in the States in most, or some states has been, but not all of the states in the year of 2025. So when I look at this movie, I think of the fun dances and joyousness, but I also think of what Forman is able to bring, the kind of sadness, the eulogy, the funeral aspect of this movie, saying that, especially with that kind of depressing, somewhat ending, this was ultimately a failure and this didn't work. And yes, it was kind of an innocence of youth, but ultimately it was kind of destroyed at the end of the day. It has a kind of nihilistic point of view, but I think it's a really interesting point of view because that's kind of how things ultimately played out. And that's why I think he's interested in making it in a year like 1979, where the critics thought that maybe it was going to pass its time. What they don't realize, it was actually one of the few pieces, and still in my mind, one of the few pieces of art that actually tries to engage with these types of people and understand who they are and their kind of point of view through song, through dance, yes, but really as a cultural movement and what they meant to kind of American history. And it was interesting that a Czech outsider decided to do that with a bunch of unknown actors at the time through a musical. It's a weird kind of odd way to go about it, but after watching the movie, those are the things that really stood out to me. So I'd love to get your comments though down below. Let me know if you've seen this movie, what your thoughts are on it. Stay tuned to next week. We always have a video Mondays at 12 p.m. Eastern time. And if there's a director that you want me to cover or a Best Picture follow-up that you want me to cover, let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear that. But that's about it. Until next time, Stay tuned.